Hit record. All right. Thank you guys. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're well for this third in a series of webinars for our 2025 Young People's Continental Congress. So, again, my name is Jamie Hollifield, Program Manager for National History Day. The Young People's Continental Congress is a wonderful partnership between Carpenters Hall and National History Day, and a whole collaboration of philanthropic partners who have provided resources to really help educate you, the teachers and students in this program. Without these philanthropic partnerships, YPCC would not exist. There is one specific partnership that we have as a new philanthropic partner. We just got a partnership with American Heritage Chocolates. So that's great. So again, you're going to watch a little video in our upcoming module for Module 4 and also for Module 5 to understand kind of the history of chocolate making in the Continental era. And then there'll be a little handout that you guys will read about the history of this wonderful organization in Module 4. So I just want to make sure I put that out there. But that is a new added wonderful partner. So you guys will be hearing more about that in our live in-person week in July in Philadelphia. So before we transition to Dr. Gillis, I have a few housekeeping reminders. So again, just as a reminder, the Q&A box is available. Our chat is disabled, but if you have any questions about readings or the lecture from Dr. Gillis, we will take a whole bunch of questions at the end of the webinar. So if something pops in your head, please jot it down so you don't forget. And then as a reminder, we do have chat disabled on this account, okay? We are taking attendance using the survey at the end of the webinar. So please make sure that you stay until the end. And then there'll be access to a link of a QR code at the end of the webinar that you can complete that survey. So make sure right now, I know that Google Classroom is probably yelling at you, telling you your webinar is late. It is not late. It is fine. You don't need to submit anything. So as long as you complete our survey at the end using either the link or the QR code, you should be set, and we will give credit to everybody who completes that survey. So the next thing you need to know is that we do have live captioning enabled. So it will caption our speakers throughout the night. Closed captioning is AI generated. It's not perfect, but it's decent, and it will help you to understand the webinar. If you think that it's annoying or if it bothers you or gets in the way, then just go ahead and hit that live CC button on the menu and it will turn it right off. And if you change your mind, you can turn it back on the exact same way. The slides in the webinar, or for the webinar, and the video for tonight's webinar will be posted in Google Classroom tomorrow, so look for that. Our Module 3 discussion board is wrapping up, and at this point, you should have completed your initial post and your replies to two of your peers in the discussion board. Just in case you forgot, please make sure you wait until after this webinar. Please don't try to post and listen to the webinar at the same time. Another reminder, your team assignment on placing Boston King within the historical context is due by this upcoming Thursday, March 20th, to Google Classroom. So either the student or the teacher can post it. We just need one person to submit it, and then we'll go ahead, take a look at it, and make sure that the feedback goes to both the teacher and the student. Module 4 will launch this Friday. So we're going to follow that cycle every time we wrap a module. You turn in your assignment, then we'll launch the next day to go into the next 4 weeks. So at this point, we have 2 remaining modules left. Our Module 4 is going to focus on the Freedmen's Bank, and then Module 5 is going to focus on women and these ideas of liberty and freedom. Okay? So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gillis, who will present the lecture for tonight's webinar.
Great, thank you. Let me just set up my screen sharing and okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, I can see your slides.
Fantastic. So yes, tonight we're going to talk about liberty and freedom, and really access a discussion about liberty by looking at the absence of liberty. So another way of thinking about tonight's talk could be thinking about freedom and slavery in the era of the American Revolution. So just really quickly, we are halfway through our online program. The next two webinars, the next two modules are going to step back and start to think about how the themes we've been talking about here carry on into subsequent generations in US history, bringing us up to the present. Because the last thing that we wanted all of you to think coming away from this experience was that America 250 is just about remembering what happened 250 years ago. This is a history that's still very much alive and well, and in ways that I think will come through the more that we keep talking with each other. Just another quick housekeeping reminder on my side of things. I asked you ahead of this session to do a couple of readings and to look at a couple of videos. So the National Liberty Museum, Jenna Chudy, created an introduction video that I think raised some really helpful questions. We tend to talk about liberty and freedom as if it's obvious what they are, but it's worth stepping back and thinking, what do I think actually qualifies as liberty? What does liberty mean in my life? What kinds of liberties do I experience? And looking back at the history of Frederick Douglass, Boston King, and some of the other people that we engaged with today really helps think a lot about liberty and freedom and how the revolutionary period called these into question. And this is Bam Bam, by the way. So I also asked you to read some excerpts from Boston King's memoir, a speech by Frederick Douglass, which we also shared a video of Douglass's descendants reading, and two secondary sources. An article by the historian Cassandra Pybus, which is looking at people like Boston King, and a resource from the Museum of the American Revolution that we will visit the museum together in July, and that points out that there weren't just Black loyalists, there were Blacks who served in the Continental Army, and puts those experiences side by side. So for today's talk, I don't know why the PowerPoint made these all question number one, but we'll roll with it. I came up with four guiding questions. We'll start with Frederick Douglass and think about, from his perspective, what the legacies of the American Revolution were. We read a speech of his from the 1850s, very much engaging with the history that we've been talking about. Next, we'll talk a little bit about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. We've talked about this before, but this time we're going to look at revisions that Jefferson made to his first draft. Next, we'll talk a little bit about what freedom and liberty meant for Boston King and his family. And ultimately, come back to the question, was the American Revolution a turning point in the history of slavery and freedom? So, one of the readings for today was from Frederick Douglass, probably his most famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And we're going to start with a poll. I think it's helpful sometimes to get you using your brains, thinking about primary sources. This is in many ways a warm-up for our conversation today. And I'll just be clear, the polls that I have today, in none of them is there a right answer. I'm asking you to pay attention to things and pick up on details that jumped out to you. And in some ways, the first thing that I, as a historian, do when I see a primary source is read through it and see where my attention goes. Sometimes phrases, words grab our attention. And so this poll asks, which phrases from this speech do you think are most meaningful, can help us best understand what Frederick Douglass was trying to express about the American Revolution?
All right. So I just launched that poll. So go ahead if you are able to pick whichever answer you feel like would best address the question. And again, the question is, which of the following phrases do you find most useful for understanding Douglas's view of the legacy of the American Revolution? Okay. So I'll give people maybe about 10 more seconds to answer. So if you haven't answered, you can answer right now. And I'll go ahead and end that poll. Okay, so it looks like the 12% said the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice. About uh, eight individuals said the existence of slavery brands your republicanism a sham. And then 14 out of 25 said your national inconsistencies, but nobody selected question or the answer D.
American institutions, they're just not popular these days. Okay, great. Um, so a pretty good mix, though national inconsistencies jumping to the fore. And I think that's very much the theme of Frederick Douglass's speech overall. But one of the things that I think can help understand why this speech has endured, why it's been so popular for generations of Americans, is that while Frederick Douglass uses fiery language here, he points out that slavery is about the worst thing that he can imagine. It saps everything good about the United States. He ultimately comes around to the idea, he comes back to the idea that that's not because the United States is necessarily inconsistent. He sees the existence of slavery and those inconsistencies in American history as the exception and something that can be changed, that can be overcome. He describes the Constitution, so not the Declaration, but the Constitution as a glorious liberty document, a glorious liberty document. And goes on to argue from his vantage that people who say it's pro-slavery are mistaken. And well, I would, as a historian, I would say I think he's right. The Constitution is not pro-slavery. It does protect slavery. Um, he's also absolutely correct that the Constitution never comes out and says slavery is good or necessary or valuable. In some ways, the absence of the word slavery from the Constitution is really meaningful. And he traces this legacy of liberty back to the Declaration. Um, so forget about this dark picture of America I've been sharing with you while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies against slavery, is sort of implied here, of the age. So he says, the United States is really remarkable, even as it is a place where terrible things happen. And that relationship between liberty and slavery, between freedom and its absence, has been a really powerful force in American history. It's driven generations of Americans to argue about what the legacy of the founding actually means in practice. So I think Douglass says, hey, the Declaration is great. It gave us principles. It helped establish the institutions of freedom, institutions that protect freedom and liberty. Um, the second guiding question that I asked for today was, what about the Declaration? We talked about the finished Declaration in the first module, but Thomas Jefferson didn't just sit down and write a document, in a feat of divine inspiration. As this draft, as you can see, the backdrop for this slide is one of Jefferson's extant drafts of the Declaration of Independence that's in the Library of Congress. There's another at the American Philosophical Society right next to Independence Hall. He reworked it. So in many ways, the most famous part of this document is the statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is a section that you can see, if you look at the details here, Jefferson has tinkered with. He's rearranged things. It's hard to see in great detail, but this passage this passage has changed. But it's by far, it is far from the most significant change to Jefferson's draft. And I think thinking about Frederick Douglass's speech as a whole, it's also really helpful to step back into the world of the Declaration and think about this idea that all men are created equal in relation to the rest of the document. And so the last grievance, the last complaint that Thomas Jefferson lobs at the King of England in the Declaration of Independence is this one. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now, when I talk about this passage with college students, they usually hone in on the part about Native Americans. Say, look, the king is ordering Native Americans to slaughter us. That's definitely an exaggeration. But the first part of this complaint is actually really important, and everybody in the future United States at the time of the Declaration of Independence would know what he meant. It wasn't a huge secret. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. Well, what did he mean? Fortunately, this is a place where we can compare the finished declaration with his first draft. And so here, he originally had said he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating these sacred rights that are spelled out at the beginning, the rights of life and liberty, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to miserable death along the way. He's talking about the slave trade here. And he blames the king personally. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel, meaning not Christian, powers, is the warfare of a Christian king. He says this is an affront to the Christianity of the King of England. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished die, fancy rhetoric, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms amongst us. This is the passage that became, he is exciting domestic insurrections. He is exciting those very people to rise in arms among us. Because domestic in this period means within our country and also within our household, like our domestic goods. Our house is our domicile. So he's causing rebellion in our houses, in our communities. And to purchase that liberty of which he deprived them by murdering the people upon whom he also has obtruded them. So he's saying, to make it worse, not only is he enslaving people, but he is trying to get those enslaved people to rise up in rebellion against us and kill the people that he forced to accept slaves in the first place. So we're the victims here. Now, this passage isn't in the Declaration of Independence. It's no longer there. And I think it's useful to understand a little bit about the context in which this document was written. Because the reason this complaint made sense to especially white male colonists was it was a reference to something that actually happened. So you may have heard about Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Lord Dunmore was the last royal governor of Virginia. And in November 1775, as he was losing control of the colonial government in Virginia, he offered freedom to enslaved people and indentured servants, people who owed their labor to somebody else, who would run away from patriots and come and fight for him to put down this rebellion. Freedom, individual freedom for fighting against the revolution. And this was not just an empty promise. Several other British officials over the course of the war echoed this promise. It was repeated in a few other colonies at a few other times. And it's really, really difficult to know for sure how many people actually took him up on this offer. I mean, it wasn't really him. He soon after Dunmore's proclamation, he was forced out of the colony. But the British, over the course of the war, were often very open to engaging enslaved people for military support or as servants. And so some historians estimate that as many as 100,000 enslaved people ran away. That's probably higher than the actual figure. The Museum of the American Revolution, I think, quoted somewhere like 10 to 20,000. But a lot of people in this period. About 7 to 10,000 of them are actively serving the British in some capacity. And that's what Jefferson is talking about. He's saying the king is responsible for slavery. He brought these people over here. And now the king's agents, and ultimately coming from the king's authority, they're offering freedom to people to murder us. That's a really, really hefty accusation. So let's pause for another poll because, as I said, that language is not in the Declaration anymore. So why do you think the rest of the delegates of the Continental Congress put it out, removed it from the finished document? So I've given a couple of suggestions here. Again, this is speculation. We don't know for sure, though I'll talk a little bit more about what the historical record suggests. So, concerns about hypocrisy, because many members of the Continental Congress benefited from slavery. Support for slavery, people actually thought slavery and the slave trade is a good thing. Distraction from primary complaints, like let's not mess around with slavery, let's focus on taxation and our rights. Fears of domestic insurrections. They're just afraid of slave rebellions or some other explanation.
Okay. So I'll give you guys about another 10 seconds to respond. Again, the question is, why do you think the Continental Congress removed language about the slave trade from the Declaration? Okay. So if you haven't made a selection, please make one. And then I'll go ahead and end the poll. All right, so it looks like our winner is distraction from primary complaints is the top for the highest percentage. The second highest was concern about hypocrisy. Many members benefited from slavery. The third highest was support for slavery and the slave trade. Second to last was fears of domestic insurrection, and it looks like the lowest was for some other explanation.
Okay. And I'm not surprised that there was a mix of answers here, because I think uh, all of them are plausible explanations, especially some other explanation, because you may have brilliant explanations. And I hope when we get to the Q&A, some of you offer some explanations for why this might be. Um, Thomas Jefferson, much later in his life, wrote an autobiography and sort of reflected on what happened back at the time that he was writing the Declaration. This is enough later that it's to be taken with a grain of salt. It may be exaggerated, but he said, basically, I brought this document into the Congress, and the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia said, no, thank you. We are not going to talk about the slave trade and slavery. Um, Coincidentally, these are the colonies with the largest proportion of enslaved people in the overall population. But Jefferson also suggested that Northerners who profited from slavery also backed away, were not very interested in this. And I think when we look at the surviving evidence from the war itself, this idea that enslaved people might rebel was really, really frightening to a lot of uh, free people in this period. They were really worried that uh, the wheels might come off of the social order. Um, Ultimately, though, this passage gets removed. So slavery is in the backdrop, the slave trade especially. It's referenced obliquely in the Declaration of Independence. It's not at the fore. And I think in part because it also stands in such contrast to the opening statement about all men being created equal. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about the American Revolutionary period, the Revolutionary War, the turmoil as colonists and colonies challenged British authorities, is that it opened up a lot of space for people of different backgrounds, men and women, young and old, free and enslaved, to question just about everything about the social order. So colonial British America was a place where there were hierarchies. Some people had more rights than others. Men with property, free men with property, could do a lot more than just about anyone else. And so we can look at the American Revolution from a lot of different perspectives and pay attention to the ways in which many different groups of people said, hey, am I going to be better served by being part of the British Empire or being part of a free and independent United States? Do these grand claims about liberty, equality, and freedom apply to me or just to the delegates in the Continental Congress? And that's in part why I thought it would be helpful to bring in this resource from the Museum of the American Revolution. We're going to spend a day there in July. It's a really wonderful institution. And I really like their resources around freedom and slavery. There's more parts to this module. But I think the question that they pose, how did the revolution impact people of African descent, is a really important one. Because for most enslaved and free Black men and women, they looked at this moment of change and were less interested in whether the United States became independent or Britain remained in control. Many of them saw it as an opportunity to create more freedom, to secure more liberties for themselves and their families. And so they're betting on which side was likeliest to create opportunities to escape from slavery or to end slavery. And this is not some exceptional aspect of the period. Slavery runs through the context of the founding documents. About a third of the Continental Congress delegates claimed enslaved people as their property. And there were significant numbers of enslaved people and a not insignificant number of free Black people in the United States. Before the United States Census of 1790, we have to do a little bit of estimation. The records are much less accurate. But you can see I've included some census figures here. The total population of the colonies was somewhere in 1770 was somewhere around 2.1 million. About 21%, about 20% of those people were Black or of African descent. And that number stays fairly consistent. We know in the US Census of 1790, which is the first, not perfect, but comparatively accurate counting, about 20% of the population of the United States is Black, and many of those people are enslaved. So when we talk about Boston King, when we look at the experiences of Mary Perth and Harry Washington, we're not talking about just individuals. Their story can help us understand the experiences of other people who are countering or encountering similar dilemmas about how to secure freedom and liberty for their families. Um, and as you can see, if you think about South Carolina, one of the states that supposedly told Thomas Jefferson to remove the slave trade from the Declaration, a full 36.4% of the population was enslaved in 1790. So slavery is an incredibly important part of life in the Carolinas and a few of the other colonies in this period. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't also stress, as the Museum of the American Revolution does, that this was not the only way that people saw an avenue towards freedom. Some free and enslaved black men pushed for the opportunity to fight in the Continental Army and align themselves with the rebellious colonies and saw that as the best way to secure freedom. Um, but it was really up in the air. Now, I think when we think about slavery, it's sometimes really hard to access the experiences of individual people. That's one of the reasons why Boston King's story is so powerful and so important. Um, we don't have that many documents that tell the stories of people who were born into slavery. There are some, but not that many. And uh, it's easy, I think, when you look at raw numbers to just be like, oh, 200,000 people. Okay. It's helpful to understand the scale of the experience of slavery. But it's also easy to miss the human scale, the human experience. And that's why I wanted to share this image. This is an image that I take from the Monticello Digital Classroom. Thomas Jefferson recorded in his notes about his farm at Monticello what the weekly ration that he gave to each enslaved field worker was. And this is it. This is not for a day. This is for a week. It's a peck of cornmeal, which looks like what you see there, a half pound of pork or pickled beef. Here you see pork and four salted fish. That's it. And this is the rations for people who are doing manual labor from sunup to sundown. Um, I'm pretty sure I would be very hungry if that's all I had to eat for the week. Now, it's worth noting that most enslaved people also farmed a little bit on the side. They usually had one day to themselves, often Sunday. And so they probably would have had fruits and vegetables to go along with this. So it's not all of it. Um, but I think that that is a detail, something about daily life that allows us to think about what the world looked like for people like Boston King, at least while he was still an enslaved person. And all of that is to help contextualize why I wanted you to spend some time with Boston King's narrative. Now, I recognize this is a complicated, sometimes confusing source. He moves through a lot of really dramatic stuff really quickly, and sometimes it's easy to read through it and like miss, oh, wait, he was just spying for the British. There's some details there that are easy to overlook. But as we think about this source and what it tells us about the context of the American Revolution, I think it's really helpful, powerful for helping us see the many different aspects of freedom and liberty that enslaved people could be robbed of. So I asked you to read Boston King's memoirs. And again, no right answer. I just wanted to touch base with all of you and see what stuck with you from this source. So, which aspect of freedom from slavery do you think Boston King most valued? And I give you a few options here.
All right, so I'll give you guys about 10 to 15 seconds to select your answer. And again, your choices for aspects are making decisions in terms of what Boston King most valued, earning a living, education, religion, or freedom from fear. So we'll do about 5 more seconds. And I'll go ahead and end the poll. All right, so it looks like our winner was freedom from fear as the highest percentage in selection, with making decisions being second. It was a tie between earning a living and religion, and nobody chose education at all. I think it's kind of interesting.
Disappointed. Not even the teachers?
No.
Actually, I think I can understand why the teachers wouldn't pick education. Um, but yes, I think one of the things that you note in a source like this is just how casual the descriptions of violence can be. You know, he talks about being beaten and tortured, people threatening to whip him. Um, a lot of his experience of the American Revolution is being afraid that someone is going to assault him or attack him or punish him. And so, uh, yes, freedom from fear is a really important element. Those of you who know your American history may have cottoned onto the reference here. It's freedom from fear is one of the four freedoms from that Franklin Delano Roosevelt asserted in World War II. But we see Boston King struggled on all of these fronts to make to continue to be able to make decisions for himself, to earn a living, to secure an education, to practice religion, and to escape from a situation in which he was always vulnerable. And so just to help clarify, because I know the source can be a little bit confusing, based on this source and a very small handful of other extant records, it's possible to sort of piece together the details of King's life. We know he was born in 1760, or right around 1760 in Charleston, South Carolina. Again, the state with the highest proportion of enslaved people. Um, in 1776, he was apprenticed as a carpenter. And in some ways, this would have set him up to be a really successful and high status enslaved person, a person who learned a trade and had a skill and could expect not to be laboring in the fields, but to be practicing his trade on a plantation or in the town. In 1780, the British occupied Charleston. They seized Charleston, one of the most important cities in the South, and soon after King joins them, in the narrative, he makes an excuse, you know, like, hey, I was worried I was going to get punished, so I ran away to the British. And almost immediately gets smallpox. The British leave him behind. And then they come back and he has to keep sort of foisting himself on the British. He has to keep trying to reassert his freedom from slavery. He runs away multiple times. Over the course of the war, he experiences a lot of economic instability. He works for a while as a servant because he doesn't have tools. He works as a carpenter, he works as a sailor, and uh, there's a reference to it here, but a couple of points. You know, he's a spy for the British. He sort of escapes behind enemy lines, just pretends to be going about his business, and ultimately saves the group of British militiamen that he's with. Sometime during this period, he marries a woman named Violet. And in 1783, at the end of the American Revolutionary War, he and Violet are evacuated by the British from New York to Nova Scotia in Canada. Somewhere along the way, he becomes a Methodist minister, and his story is recorded in part because he's a Methodist minister, and Methodist missionaries think his story is really interesting. Methodists during this period like to tell people's conversion stories. And that's why his account gets written down, and many other folks who had similar experiences aren't written down. Um, but when you look at the details, and again, you've all had a chance to read this source, but a couple of details that jumped out to me as being helpful for understanding what liberty and freedom meant to Boston King um, is just, as you noted, how constantly vulnerable his freedom was. At one point, he meets with a loyalist militiaman named Captain Lewis, who says, like, basically, if you don't behave, if you don't listen to me and treat me like I'm your master, I'm going to put you in irons. I'm going to put you in chains, and I'm going to beat you every morning, which sounds a lot like slavery. Basically threatens to re-enslave him. Um, just because he was with the British, who had promised freedom, doesn't mean that he had achieved freedom. He's constantly reasserting it. At one point, he tries to work as a carpenter, um, but he didn't have the tools he needed, and he didn't have the money to buy them. As a servant, I stayed with one employer 4 months, but he never paid me. And again, people in this period are looking for ways to cheat each other sometimes. And in this case, he's a former slave who's run away, and the person he's laboring for is sort of like, well, I don't need to pay you, and gets away with it. Um, he also talks about the value of education. He looks at the life of these people who've run away to freedom and say, they're able to go to school at night. They're able to learn to read. Enslaved people were denied the ability to learn to read in many places, though it would only be later that many southern states actually made it a crime to teach an enslaved person to read. And so he says, this education, it's wonderful. When I'm done working, I have time for myself. I can learn. I learn to read the Bible. Um, but alas, all these enjoyments, getting fed well, getting educated, could not satisfy me without liberty. So this is intellectual freedom, but also recognition. He wants all of these freedoms. He wants all of these liberties. I think in one of the most powerful passages of this account, at least for me, when the war comes to an end in 1783, most people he's in New York at the time, and most people in New York really happy. This war that's been going on for years that has resulted in tens of thousands of deaths and many, many people being wounded, it's over. But what about these people who had been promised freedom by the British? They're depressed. They're worried they're going to be sold back into slavery or returned to their former masters. And we see a little bit of an example here where at the end there's a happy resolution. The British come around and say, all slaves should be free who had claimed the sanction and privileges of the proclamations, respecting the security and protection of the Negro. So basically, those people that we promised freedom, we're going to stand up for. Now, they weren't able to do it for all of the people who served for them over the course of the war, but ultimately about 3,000 enslaved people were taken from New York by the British to Nova Scotia, which remained a British colony in this period. Um, and this is despite the best efforts of the Americans. In the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolutionary War, the American delegation that you can see in the background here in this unfinished portrait, they demanded, one of the things they asked for was a clause that said that all Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants that had been seized during the war should be returned. Um, the British, as you read about in Pybus's article, don't comply. And they're able to secure the freedom of at least some of the people who they promised freedom to. Um, Now, ultimately, a group of these so-called Black loyalists, blacks who had fought with the British, ended up taking another offer to go to uh, the west coast of Africa and help establish a British philanthropic enterprise, a new British colony called Sierra Leone, that described itself as the province of freedom. It was a place where uh, freed slaves, people who had been enslaved, could make a new life for themselves. Now, again, as you saw in the Pybus article, Sierra Leone is not a bastion of freedom. There's a lot of tension and struggle there, in part because these people like Boston King and Mary Perth and Harry Washington, they are serious about channeling revolutionary ideals. And so they keep a bit of this American revolutionary rhetoric with them, and they challenge the colonial government that's set up in Sierra Leone. Of course, there's also malaria, and there's ongoing conflicts with the African people who actually live there already. It's a bit of a mess, but uh, for some Black men and women, the surest path to freedom during the American Revolutionary War was to fight against the independence of the United States, and ultimately to leave, to find freedom elsewhere. And I think it's really important, especially at a time like this, where we're having lots of public conversations about what we say about history, what histories we tell, to step back and think about where we fit all of these experiences. Boston King, Mary Perth, Harry Washington, Moses Wilkinson, Frederick Douglass, and also some of the Black men and women who aligned themselves with the Continental Army. How do we fit this into the history of the American Revolution? It's not a super easy question, but I think this is a good moment to come back to where we started with Frederick Douglass. Because Frederick Douglass was born into slavery. He fought most of his life against the institution of slavery. He was pursued by people who claimed him as property for a good chunk of his adult life. And he still looked back on this period as a period where wonderful ideals were established, where something new and powerful and important was created. Um, and when we talk about the American Revolution, about the founding, it's I don't think it does justice to the experience of any of the people alive to ignore just how important the contrast between slavery and freedom was for nearly every aspect of life during this period. Slavery and the experiences of enslaved people cut across politics and religion, economics and trade, and family life. This institution shaped ideas about gender and culture. It's everywhere. It's in the writings of the founders, and in the lives of the people that we're focused on here. In Carpenters Hall on December 1st, 1774, the First Continental Congress enacted a ban on all ships engaged in the slave trade as part of its protest against British policy. It's one of the earliest things that the Continental Congress does. They say, hey, we're going to stop trading in British goods. One of the things they say that they don't want to allow to be traded is enslaved people. The Declaration of Independence, as we talked about, referenced domestic insurrections and at least initially had a clause about the slave trade. And slavery runs through the Constitution as well, in ways that we can talk about more when we're in person in Philadelphia. Like Boston King, Mary Perth, and Moses Wilkinson, Frederick Douglass experienced slavery, but he also experienced freedom. And that experience shaped his understanding of the American Revolution, of the Constitution. He knew intimately what it meant to have fundamental liberties, rights, and freedoms denied to him. And yet, at the very end, he remained insistent in his commitment to the United States and the promise of the Constitution and the Declaration, to assert liberty and freedom for all. It was never a guarantee, and I think in some ways, Douglas's experience helps us really understand the legacies of this history for our lives today. Because freedom and liberty are something that we inherit from the revolution, from the founding documents, but we also inherit the responsibility to protect them, and to expand them. So, just really quickly, because I mentioned the possibility of fighting for the Continental Army, I wanted to share with you, this is a document from the archives. Some Black men who served in the Continental Army were able to earn their freedom. In the case of this individual here, Prince Bailey, he was able to claim land bounty that was promised to all veterans of the Continental Army. And so we can find similar records like this. It's not a huge number, but it's relatively similar to, roughly comparable to the number of black men who fought for the British. And I will leave you with a question to set up our Q&A for today. Was the American Revolution a turning point in the history of slavery and freedom? And I'll say, certainly for Frederick Douglass, it was. Um, he saw it as the beginning of the end. So, what do all of you think?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Gillis. Very important question at the end. I love this painting. This was one of my favorite paintings as well. And I think it's really, really important to mention that freedom is not free. And we really have to not take for granted the fact that we have those specific freedoms and liberties that we have inherited from these individuals during this period of history and time. So, with that, I don't know if you want to stop sharing and I can go to the Q&A and
Yeah,
then
let me stop share.
okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And the QR code is up here for you. So again, you can throw any questions that you have into the Q&A chat box. As a reminder, again, please do not forget to complete the feedback survey. This is a way that we track not only your attendance for our webinar, but provide you credit for either attending or watching the webinar. So please make sure that you either scan the QR code or use the link http tinyurl.com/nhd hyphen ypcc. Okay, or you can use the QR code. So again, if you have any questions that you would like to ask Dr. Gillis, please make sure you throw them in the chat. And I do have Dr. Grensevich here to help assist on the Q&A. And we have really good wait time. So we have, again, 8 minutes left of this. We can extend it as well if there are more questions beyond that. But go ahead, throw your questions in the chat. What questions do you have for Dr. Gillis? I know there was one earlier.
There was one earlier. Um, Let me just read this so I can make sure that I share it appropriately. A grievance that you were referring to, Dr. Gillis. Is this also referring to the other colonists, not just the enslaved, who were willing to side with the loyalists? Or do you feel this is exclusively in reference to Dunmore's proclamation?
It's a good question. This is in reference to the domestic insurrections grievance. From the context and the way in which the draft evolved, I think it's hard to make the case that it's about anything other than the Dunmore's proclamation and the threat of rebellion. I mean, there are other references to the possibility of loyalists in the Declaration, and so that is another place where the framers of not the framers, the framers is the Constitution, the people who are sort of coordinating the political campaign to try and encourage people to embrace independence. They find arguments that resonate, that are repeated throughout newspapers up and down the colonies. But yeah, that particular grievance is a reference to Dunmore's proclamation.
We have a follow-up question to that. If they didn't join the British after Dunmore's proclamation, where did the escaped enslaved people go?
Some of them just ran away. And there is a lot of marronage, to throw a fancy word at you. So I live in Virginia, and here the Great Dismal Swamp is a place where it was hypothetically possible that you could just hide out. And there's a lot of escaped slaves who lived there in comparative freedom for a while. Um, Some of the enslaved people, once they get to British controlled areas, they're just like, oh, well, I'm here. And they just start going about their lives. It's a little bit difficult to say because so few accounts from the perspective of enslaved people who ran away still survive. And a lot of what we read is from British military officials being like, "Hey, there's all these enslaved people here," or colonists who are like, "This is terrifying, and this is destroying my economic livelihood."
Okay.
Um,
We have a couple of other questions, asking for suggestions for other resources.
Yeah, I see the two questions. One is about Boston Kings specifically. You can find the Methodist magazine where his full account is published, is available in Google Books, I think. And we read some excerpts here, but you can find more about him. There's a few teaching resources that are also available out there. The Really the only other major source for Boston King's life is the Book of Negroes, which is the records that the British keep of the people who were taken to Nova Scotia. And so, in Cassandra Pybus's article, she talks about the Book of Negroes and a lot of what we know about like Harry Washington. Comes from the fact that we can show that they were on particular ships and trace their stories. I don't think that there's much documentation about Boston King in Sierra Leone. Um, and uh, if you're looking for secondary sources, the article that I assigned here is a good one. It doesn't talk about King himself, um, but Maya Jasanoff's book about loyalists in the American Revolution has a great chapter on Black loyalists. Um, Materials by or about formerly enslaved women is another good question. I believe, if memory serves, that Mary Perth has an account kind of like Boston King's, that may have even been published. I would check the citations in the article I assigned. There are later accounts from the perspective of enslaved women. Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative is probably the most famous. Um, and there's really wonderful histories of the daily lives of enslaved people. Um, and uh, we get traces of enslaved people in all kinds of different archives. So there are historians who've gone around and sort of collected these details together and pieced together the lives of individuals.
One of the most impactful that I found relating to what you're saying, Dr. Gillis, is Tia Miles's All That She Carried.
Yeah.
So certainly not the same time period that we're talking about tonight, but if you're interested in how historians use traces of objects, of non-existent objects, to tell the histories of enslaved women, I would really recommend checking out All That She Carried.
Yeah, it's a great book. And in recent years, there's some really wonderful historians who've done incredible things with archival record.
Yep. All right, we have another question here that I can read aloud for everyone. I understand that Jefferson points the finger at South Carolina and Georgia as culprits for not wanting an inclusion of slavery in the slave trade. But didn't he and the delegates from Virginia stand to lose quite a lot in terms of their lifestyles and livelihoods? He didn't have a history of freeing very many of his enslaved workers, right?
No. Thomas Jefferson's relationship with slavery is messy, and uh, you probably heard about his relations with Sally Hemings. Um, at one point, I forget the details on this, so I should probably be careful about saying too conclusively. I believe Thomas Jefferson sold his brother-in-law. Um, an illegitimate uh, ch child who was, directly related to his wife. Um, Jefferson was not the most enlightened of the founders when it comes to race and racial equality. The notes on the state of Virginia, he sort of leans in on what he saw as inherent racial difference. Whereas George Washington at least recognized he wrote a lot about how he thought slavery was bad, and he ultimately freed some of the enslaved people that he owned and weren't part of his wife's estate. Um, but yeah, I think when I talk about that revision to the Declaration with my college students, they're like, "Whoa, like that's hypocrisy here." Because yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very important to recognize that he is critical of the slave trade. He says slavery is bad, but really it's the slave trade that he hones in on. And if you know your Constitution, one of the things, the compromises in the Constitution is that they will not abolish the slave trade for at least 20 years, but 20 years later, it's abolished.
Mhm.
A lot of people who are ambiguous about slavery or aren't sure how to end it think that the slave trade is the worst part of it, and so they go after that first.
Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Actually, we do have one that just popped in. But before you read that one off, Dr. Grincevich, again, just another reminder, make sure before we leave to complete that feedback survey, either using the QR code or the link address that's listed on your screen.
All right, Dr. Gillis, are you ready for another question?
I am.
Okay, I'll read it off to you. Do you believe that the British, I'm sorry, do you believe that the British offered protection to formerly enslaved people who fought for them to maintain their promise, or did they have ulterior motives?
Um, they uh, definitely had ulterior motives. Um, it's easy to look at Lord Dunmore especially and be like, oh, look, he's freeing the slaves. He's this enlightened person. He was not. He at this point had sort of been chased out of the capital. He and his administration ultimately end up like governing from boats in the Chesapeake. There, he just sees this as a means to an end.
Mhm.
And when you look at the Continental Army, initially, the Continental Congress tries to prevent enslaved people from serving, and ultimately, for a while, they ban enslaved and free people from serving. But then, under pressure, in part because they need more men, but also because black men are like, "Hey, we want to serve." They cave. That policy changes, and it sort of waffles a little bit from here to there. But a lot of military and political leaders are worried that if they start going around offering freedom to some slaves, all slaves are going to want freedom. And many people do not see that as an ideal outcome here.
Hey, we have one more question in the queue. Did Washington and other founding fathers who, quote, lost slaves seek remuneration?
That's a great question. There are a number of efforts to try and get both the British government and some of the colonies, or, the now states to pay people back for property that's lost or destroyed during the Revolution. I don't know off the top of my head of any instances in which people sought um, compensation or remuneration for enslaved people, but it's quite possible that did happen. In most cases, this is a really long, drawn out process, and usually people end up disappointed. If they get something, it's not very much. Um, so, uh, yeah, that's a great question.
All right. So looks like we have one more question just popped in.
All right. Did the British treat enslaved people more humane as slaves, or was the treatment about the same? And can we make generalizations like that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Dr. Vencevich. Um, we really can't make generalizations. There is a tendency sometimes for people living today to try and like make history into an easy story. And it's, they were bad and we were good. Um, the truth is usually much messier and muddier than that. Um, During this period, by the time of the American Revolution, a British court, Judge Mansfield, had already ruled in the Somerset decision that slavery was incompatible with English liberties and freedoms. But that only applied in England itself. And um, there were more abolitionists in Britain than there were in the colonies. But many of the abolitionists were not necessarily um, proponents of the idea of racial equality. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why British abolitionists get so excited about Sierra Leone. It's like, well, we don't want black people here. Let's move them back to Africa, which is really complicated when you recognize that most of the people who are being taken to Africa, the free people, were not born there. And maybe not even their parents were born there. They certainly don't speak African languages. Um, so there are um, some British people who recognize slavery as bad. Um, but yeah, it's muddy. Uh, that ultimately for enslaved people, even if they have they live with a family that treats them comparatively well, it's like at the end of the day, they can't leave.
Right.
Yeah, it also reminds me of too the establishment of Liberia as well. Very similar
Hmm.
context and some parallels to this as well. All right, so I am going to go ahead and stop sharing. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Gillis for taking the time to present for Module 3 for YPCC this evening. And again, if you have any questions, you can reach out to him. I know that the presentation will be posted tomorrow. His email address is also listed in there as well. And the video and the rest of the slides, in case you would like to use them, will be posted in Google Classroom as well as there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.